leave a message for Judson Brewer. Thanks.
At the tone, please record your message.
Hi, this is Judson Brewer.
Hi, Dr. Brewer. This is Alan Reed. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Wonderful. Is it still a good time to talk for a few minutes?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm sure my number is coming up looking pretty weird on your phone. I'm calling from a Google account. So
yes, it says restricted. So
yeah.
when you called back and I saw that it was noon, I took the risk and answered.
That usually is what happens. Yeah. So no worries. Thank you very much for talking with me. It's a real privilege to talk with you. I've read your work. I've followed you. I've watched your TED video. I talk about you in my classes, and it's a real honor to speak with you. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I guess I'll just jump right into it. I'm writing the book on smartphone dependency. I hesitate to use the word addiction, but that's hopefully why I'm talking to you. I'm really exploring the paradoxical nature that we have with smartphones and the ways that they're good and the ways that they're bad and the ways that they affect us mentally, socially, emotionally. So in your book, you talk about the relationship between happiness and gratification. And I'm really focused in on gratification in terms of smartphone use. Can you talk about that a little bit, gratification in the short term versus the long term, and how a healthy balance plays into that?
Sure. So let's define our terms first. So by gratification, are you talking about gratification of our desires or cravings, or what do you mean by gratification?
Yeah, I believe cravings. So I guess talking more specifically, positive and negative reinforcements.
Okay, sure. So if we think of, just basically like, if we feed a craving, that's a gratification, just to make sure we're on the same page. So anytime that we do that, that's how positive and negative reinforcement work. That's how they perpetuate themselves. And this is why people who eat dessert after dinner get in the habit of having dessert after dinner, because their brain says, oh, just had dinner, time for dessert. The same is true, but can actually be perpetuated on a much more rapid time scale with phones. Every time we pull out our phone, which could be as simple as doing like not knowing the answer to something and saying, oh, who won the Super Bowl 2 years ago? Mm-hmm. And then asking Google, hey, Google, who won the Super Bowl 2 years ago? And then we get an answer, and we've got this instant gratification for something that's completely meaningless. Generally, we're going to forget it 10 minutes later. Does that make sense as a place to start?
Absolutely. That's exactly the sentiment that I'm talking about in the book. And one of the things, and I'm in complete agreement with you, one of the things I'm finding is a complete pushback of this notion that we're losing anything in that process. I think that we are. I mean, I've read a lot of Nicholas Carr and Turkle and a lot of those same types of authors who argue that there's a consequence to doing that, just simply Googling, to receive an instant answer. But there are lots of people who don't see the downside to that. And I was hoping maybe you could shed light on that.
Yeah. I also have a lot of patients who are alcoholics who don't think that they have a problem.
Yeah. So one of the things too is specifically using the word addiction. And I've spoken with several people for this book. One of them was David Greenfield. He runs the Center for Internet and Technology Addiction up in Connecticut, and he's very adamant about equating this with addiction, as are you. And I know that it's not recognized formally by the APA or in the DSM or anything, but I was hoping maybe you could speak to how this is essentially our digital addiction and why we should treat it so, and not just treat it as, yet another technological scapegoat that we're just calling an addiction.
Well, so I think if we use I'm also sorry, getting a bunch of feedback. I don't know if you're hearing that as well, or if I just am.
No, I don't hear it.
Can we do this? Can you call my landline and let's see if that does a better job at not having me hear myself every word that I speak.
That's annoying.
Yeah, or I can call you if you have a phone number.
Let me call your landline first and let's see if that works.
Okay. Do you have that?
No.
It's 508-856-1632.
Great. I'll call you right now.
Okay. Great. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, let's see if that's better.
Yeah, how does that sound?
Ready. Great. Sometimes cell phones and Google Voice don't get along that well. Or maybe it was because Google Voice heard I was bashing Google. I like the simple definition of addiction being continued use despite adverse consequences, because then it is behavior and device and substance agnostic, and it helps frame things like, is alcohol itself a problem? Well, no, only if continued use, causes adverse consequences. So same for somebody's phone. My phone is essential. I'm dependent upon my phone to navigate the streets of Boston. Yet if I am using it if I'm pulling my phone out in the middle of my Valentine's Day dinner with my wife, that's probably not going to go over so well.
Yes.
Right. So there's continued use despite adverse consequences.
I think and I completely agree, and that's the argument that I'm trying to make in the book. But I think what critics have a problem with is pinpointing when it's an adverse consequence, because I think there are probably plenty of people who wouldn't see a problem, particularly younger people, who wouldn't see a problem with using their phones in certain social scenarios. So how do we define what the adverse consequences are?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it depends on what is, as Conan the Barbarian says, what is meaningful in life. So if relationships are meaningful for us in life, we can see how much does our smartphone use affect our relationships? Is it causing problems with our relationships? If we don't care about relationships with other people, then it's not going to be considered as much of a problem for us. So I think it's really, on an individual and somewhat societal level, or it's up to us to determine, what is meaningful in life in that sense. That really, this is why I think that the DSM often leaves these things murky in terms of saying, adverse consequences, because that's somewhat of a subjective call for what people want in life.
I agree. There's plenty of research coming out. Particularly, I talk a lot about memory and this idea of sort of outsourcing memory to our devices. But there are these critics, and even Wired.com published 2 articles just within the past week, sort of really being dismissive of the whole notion of technology addiction with regards to smartphones. They call it a technological scapegoat, and it's sort of yet another example of the same tropey argument that we've had when TV came around, and video games and rock and roll and everything else. And I'm really looking to try and differentiate this from those previous arguments of, look what the TV screen is going to do to our youth and that sort of thing. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, well, it's also convenient. Facebook just came out with a study saying, the solution to Facebook addiction is more Facebook. I'm not kidding. They really did come up with that. Saying, oh, passive Facebook use is a problem, so you should be more active on Facebook. And I'm thinking, are you kidding?
Right. More alcohol.
Yeah, right. So somebody wrote an article in Bloomberg about this where they brought that article to my attention and sent it along, and I was blown away by how convenient it is that somebody could say, well, we depend on Facebook ads for our livelihood. And, anyway, so I think it's really important to see who you're talking to. And so, of course, it doesn't surprise me that somebody from Wired magazine is going to write saying that this, people are coming out with doomsday things. I don't think anybody argues now that television itself is inherently bad. Yet you can find studies out there showing that violence can be directly linked to television watching. So does that mean televisions are bad? No.
Right.
But if used in a certain way, it can be linked to adverse consequences. Smartphones are no different than television in that sense.
That's a great point. Yeah, and I do talk about Kranzberg laws of technology, and his whole sort of message is that technology's it's not good, it's not bad, but it's not neutral either. It's both, right? It's all of the above. So,
yeah. So if you, for example, and I think I wrote about this in my book, if you look at childhood playground accidents.
Yeah.
If parents are on their cell phones when their kids are at the playground, one, they're going to have less of a connection with their kid. Two, their kids are going to get injured, and there's direct evidence for that. Yeah, it's not neutral.
I was just rereading that chapter. That's chapter 4, and you were talking about that study over child injuries. That's really fascinating. Yeah, it's there's so much to talk about. It's really hard to wrap my head around. So, it's difficult because I feel like we're fighting against a current of people who are reluctant to first use the term addiction, but second, even acknowledge that there's a problem. So I'm talking about, like, Dana Boyd writes about this in her book. There's another study that came out by Janae Cohn about demonizing smartphones and using what they call the addiction narrative trope, and ultimately arguing that it's doing more harm to have these conversations than good, because we're scrutinizing the very users who need the help. But I sort of take your stance, which is we have to acknowledge and identify and recognize the problem first before we can do anything about it. So,
yeah, and here, maybe it's, it just gets into heated debate camps around technology is good or technology is bad. Maybe you're already thinking about this. What about just taking the neutral standpoint and saying, look, is a knife good or bad?
Right.
Well, if it's helpful for surgery, not so helpful in a street fight. So are knives good or bad? They're just knives.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we use them, right? A scalpel could kill somebody, or it could save somebody's life. Technology, it's really helping people understand what technology does and where it can kind of get caught by our own addictive habit loops. Could be a good neutral way to approach that, to show them, look, it's neither good nor bad. It's understanding how our minds work and how it hooks them in, maybe where the problems are, and then look at all these. I'm sure you've already thought about this, but it seems like it's just like the Republicans and Democrats not agreeing on anything. There are these camps that are forming around technology, and that's not going to work either.
Yeah, and I think people just try to reaffirm what they already believe, and that's what I'm running into a lot. But so I think if we frame it as you talk about it, mostly in terms of awareness or mindfulness, I think that's that's really helpful. But my question is awareness of our habits enough, or is there something else that we need to push us into change?
Well, I think if you rub somebody's face in the shit enough, they're eventually going to smell it.
That's great. That's great.
So I don't think that's really how we learn. And so I think trying to introduce something artificial that's not as efficient as our natural learning processes is why. Why would we do that? Doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. You might as well tap into what our brains have evolved most effectively, which is the learning system, in particular reward-based learning. I think that's the one that is baked in the most.
Yeah, and that's what I appreciate about your work, is you do take a neurological perspective on this, which is what we should be doing, rather than just sort of how we feel about it, or how we are afraid of making others feel about it. So,
right, which are habit loops unto themselves.
Good point. Yeah, so I like that the idea of using the most effective approach, which is already established in the brain's learning system.
Yeah, we talk about hacking reward-based learning. That's what we're doing. We've and this has been really fascinating for me. So once I really started getting enough data, both behaviorally and neurobiologically, as to what was going on, and then was also blown away. I'm like, why aren't people seeing this more? This seems so obvious.
Yeah.
Now that Skinner's not an unknown guy,
right.
So, and Eric Kandel, Nobel Prize. I don't know why people aren't looking at this more. But that aside, we said, okay, let's see if we can actually affect change. And we've got 5 times the quit rates for smoking cessation. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's pretty good. We just published a paper showing that with an app-based training, you can get 40% reduction in craving-related eating for people who are obese or overweight and trying to curb their eating. We just developed an anxiety program showing that we can get a 47% reduction in clinically rated anxiety scores with an app-based technology up to 28 short modules. It's working in all these different realms, and we're just ramping up. We have some people pilot testing these programs to help them with technology addiction, because we don't have a program yet for that. But it's the same thing. And so we just have them tweak it here and there, and they're finding that it's helpful for them as well. So for us, even using the technology to help people overcome technology seems to be a good way to go. But it's not having them throw their phones out the window either. It's about having them learn how their minds work and getting control over them.
Right. And you hear that comparison between technology and food addiction pretty frequently, because that cessation isn't the answer for technology. So it's, I think, even harder.
Right. You don't have to smoke to survive,
right.
But you do have to eat.
That's right.
And we're not going to suddenly stop using smartphones. It's quite the opposite.
So one final question, and you've sort of touched on this already just by talking about reinforcement and learning systems, but I'm specifically interested in the notion of checking habits. And there have been plenty of studies that have done this. I've done one as well, but I guess the number that people typically will cite is about 150 times per day that we check our phones on average. And so I'm just trying to wrap my head around, how do we combat this notion of the idea that we need to constantly and subconsciously be checking our devices, and how do we get away from that? If there are plenty of tips of put your phone in the trunk when you're driving and things like that.
Those are all cognitive techniques that don't ultimately work.
Right. So what's the answer?
It's rubbing your face in it. What do I get from this when I check my phone? It's really bringing awareness to that, to see how rewarding it actually is. Our brains learn based on relative rewards. So we can look to see, okay, when I check my email every 3 minutes, how do I feel over after the last hour of work that I was supposed to do but didn't get done? How does that compare compared to not checking my email at all, focusing on the project I was supposed to work on, getting it done, and then going and checking my email in a discrete period of time, as compared to, I don't know what the average. I think the average email I saw. I don't know if this is true. The average email goes unread for only 3 minutes or 5 minutes or some
Wow.
ridiculously short period of time, where everybody's just, they're an inbox junkie.
Yeah, I was just writing about the sort of history lineage of the smartphone, and there's a great book called Losing the Signal. It's all about BlackBerry. And there's an entire chapter dedicated to their discussions internally on whether or not they essentially pioneered the push notification system. So they really internally struggled on, like, should we develop this thing that automatically notifies its users of emails, or should we let them check for them manually and retrieve them? And ultimately they went with the push system, which is obviously what we use now. But there was a real consideration over, whether people wanted that.
Yeah, and that's how the BlackBerry became known as the Crackberry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was the first one there to really do that, which was pretty interesting.
I think it's a pivotal moment.
You can't go back.
Right. No,
and somebody else would have figured that out if they didn't.
Right.
But they did.
So ultimately, you're talking about sort of reflective techniques, or more metacognitive approaches to awareness, rather than these sort of force function tips of, like, physically separating yourself from your device, or using apps that limit your usage, or things like that. It should be more metacognitively based and reflective.
Yeah, and this isn't something that you can say, here's tip 1, 2, and 3, and then you're done.
Right.
I mean, this is why we have to develop full programs for these things, and I think technology addiction is probably going to be one of the hardest ones to work with. So, in general, knowing the idea behind the underlying principles is a good place to start, and that's where these programs get developed. But yes, it basically starts with that. If you want to get a sense for how something like this could be developed, I would say just play with our Unwinding Anxiety program. Mm-hmm. We actually use smartphones as a way that, as an example for reward-based learning in that, because a lot of people will go to their smartphones to distract themselves when they're feeling anxious. And that's the idea of how I would develop something for technology addiction as well. You have to start by helping them understand what it is, so they can map out their habit loops. Then they have to see the relative rewards that they're getting from the smartphone use, and then they have to be able to tap into the greater rewards of being aware. If they don't have a greater reward, that I talk about in chapter 1 or something, that mistaking excitement for happiness, if they don't really have that differential, then their brain's never going to learn something different. So those are the basic ideas, but if you want to see it pragmatically put into use, that's what I'll hopefully in the next year or so be developing for technology, like we did for our anxiety program. It just takes a while to get all the components together, but the underlying principles are the same.
Sure, that's going to be, I'm sure, hugely successful and much needed. So, and it's coming at a great time. But your book is more relevant now than ever, I think. And yeah, that's all I had for you. So if you don't have any questions or anything else you'd like to add, I'll let you go free.
No, just say good luck writing it and have fun. It actually can be fun writing a book, as I'm sure you know.
It's like I'm just uncovering more and more layers. It's like I feel like I'm not solving anything. I'm just coming up with more questions. So, but I'm sure you understand that. So thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Brewer. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.